All right, welcome back to Rockford Reading Daily. This is episode 104, and we are still reading High Risers by Ben Austen. We are currently on chapter 9, which is entitled Faith Brought Us This Far. Dolores Wilson. When the job of president of her building opened up suddenly, Dolores Wilson wrestled with whether to take it. Like the prayer said, she needed help distinguishing between what she could and couldn't change. Her own apartment she could control, but an entire building? The roof leaked and flooded apartments were left to rot. The top 2 floors were eventually closed off altogether. People weren't supposed to go up there, but they did. Gang signs were scrawled sloppily over the stairwells and elevators. Garbage collected on the landings. It got to the point where Dolores felt too embarrassed to invite anyone over. Quote, "I can't have visitors come through all of this to get to my house," end quote, she'd say. For many years, the president of the tenant council in 1230 North Burling was a friend of hers named Ethelene Ward. Miss Ward worked with Marion Stamps to demand better services for tenants, and she helped start a community pantry. She let teenagers put on shows in the building, and she organized outings for the residents to the Wisconsin Dells and to a small lake where they played volleyball and fished, though Dolores couldn't stand to put the hook through the worm. When Miss Ward died, a reverend who lived in the building took over, but he'd been discovered recently shot dead in an elevator. People said he got him mixed up in a domestic dispute. Dolores believed that preachers should be judged not by their actions, but by their inspiring words, and she liked how at funerals the reverend would say, quote, "I'm not talking to the deceased. She can't hear me. I'm talking to all of you in the audience," end quote. But now he was the deceased, and she was still seated in the pews. She decided to take on the responsibility and succeed him as president. She called her first meeting about a year after Hubert's death. Debbie and Cheryl, her daughters, both had their own apartments in the building now, so Dolores knew they'd show up. But she figured few others would come. When she walked into the first floor rec room, though, she discovered it crowded with seniors and single mothers and little children and even some gang members. The older tenants talked about restoring 1230 North Burling to its original glory in the early 60s, when it was freshly painted and surrounded by green grass, flowers, and benches. The young parents complained about the gangs charging them to ride the elevators, about their children being beaten up and robbed, and the gangbangers who were present agreed for the most part, they too, were offended by the conditions in the high-rise. One of the gang leaders raised his hand and suggested putting stools on each floor, since children who couldn't reach the trash chutes were spilling garbage or leaving bags on the ground. A dozen people at the meeting volunteered to monitor the building in shifts. All but one of them was a woman, and many of their neighbors called them crazy, saying they were going to get shot. But they went up to the gang members and told them to set up someplace else. They worked in teams, one stationed by the back door leading to Halstead Street, another watching the front, and others on the elevators. When Kelvin Cannon moved into the building after his release from Stateville, he took a shift as well, safeguarding the elevators even as he led the disciples. Dolores pressured the CHA into replacing lights in the lobby and installing a phone there. One woman sold candy out of her apartment, and with the proceeds, the security team brought blue uniforms with a 1230 Burling patch sewn into the sleeve. Eventually, the CHA paid some of them as security guards. They carry walkie-talkies and clipboards, keeping a list of every unlocked, vacant unit and broken window to send to the housing authority. Quote, "This is where we live, and we have to protect it," end quote, Dolores said. Quote, "We started laying down the law, and we found out the law was on our side," end quote. The CHA allotted the building a small monthly stipend for miscellaneous expenses, enabling Dolores to outfit the rec room with a used pool table, a ping pong table, and a thrift shop sofa with a psychedelic design. She convinced the local store to donate 10 gallons of paint, and she paid men from the building $6 for each stairwell they painted. Some of them were so eager for work that they did 2 or 3 floors on their own. In the summer, the building hosted a rummage sale, and residents hung clothes on the fence outside. They set up grills and sold hot dogs and refreshments. A couple of tenants planted a garden on the empty land alongside the building. There was a fashion show, a coat giveaway, and a tutoring program. Dolores conscripted children to help with the tower's upkeep. The same boys and girls who might have fooled around on the elevators now wore pieces of paper with the word monitor taped to their shirts. They walked the high-rise in pairs, making sure other children didn't litter, prop open the elevator doors, or jump out of the cabins. Mayor Washington's administration gave the building a permit to block off Scott Street, just to the north of the high-rise, and the residents held a jump rope contest and a big wheel race. Because she hated competitions, the whole idea of grown people yelling when a ball didn't go in the net or a glove, Dolores awarded each child a prize. Neighbors told Dolores that they never imagined they'd clean up after someone else, but the building was looking so good that they had reached down and picked up a potato chip bag from the lobby floor. Dolores soon felt comfortable enough about the state of the high-rise to invite her pastor from Holy Family over for tea. And it thrilled her when he said from her living room that 1230 North Burling looked like no other building in Cabrini Green. Dolores still had her full-time job at the city water department, as well as her other volunteer work on local boards and committees. As the secretary of the tenant council for all of Cabrini Green, she was taking the minutes at a meeting in 1985 when the talk turned to a curious pilot program being funded by the Metropolitan Planning Council. The civic nonprofit wanted to train tenants in a few public housing developments across the city to take over management duties from the CHA. In recent years, the MPC had considered recommending that all the high-rise public housing in Chicago be torn down. But during the 1980s, both poverty and the number of families in need of low-income housing increased in Chicago while federal dollars declined and affordable housing options disappeared. The homeless population in Chicago and the number of people on the CHA waiting list swelled. Quote, given those circumstances, Chicago cannot afford to lose any housing for low-income families, including the 38,685 units of public housing, end quote, the MPC concluded. Instead, the organization explored the resident management model. The premise was that tenants would be more motivated than housing authorities or private management to renovate vacant apartments in their buildings, collect rents, and deal with bad neighbors. And besides, nothing else had worked. The resolution that the Chicago City Council passed to create what is called, quote, a vision of a brighter possible tomorrow, end quote, read more like a public housing post-mortem. Whereas the abysmal quality of services rendered to residents of Chicago Housing Authority by management is the stuff that horror stories are made of, tracts of 15 to 19-story buildings where at times elevators have been inoperative 70% of the time, residents waiting for years for new shades, for screens for their doors and windows, waiting months for replacement windows and the most simple repairs, and whereas the wholesale flight of working families from Chicago Housing Authority developments have left it a vast urban wilderness, 3/4 of whose adults are unemployed, 80% of whose households are headed by unemployed single mothers, where welfare dependence and the welfare mentality hangs like inescapable miasma in the air, coexisting with the all too frequent incidences of crime, marginality, gang violence, alcoholism, drug abuse, and other self-destructive behavior bred by the unbroken landscape of poverty and desperation. The idea that residents of public housing be put in charge of their own buildings was born not only out of desperation, but also from an unlikely union between conservatives and black activists. Resident management meant jobs and skills for African American tenants that might lead to success outside public housing. This self-empowerment aligned with the rights ideal of personal responsibility and a diminished government, what Republicans decried as the trillion-dollar, quote, poverty industrial complex, end quote, established under Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. Chicago wouldn't be the first city to try the experiment. In Boston, St. Louis, Jersey City, and Newark, public housing residents had already formed companies and taken over maintenance and daily operations in their own buildings, although the results have been mixed. Housing authorities remain wary. Landlords and building managers were supposed to be allies, partners in operating any property, yet in public housing, agencies had long had an adversarial relationship with their tenants. Residents, too, had little to no accounting, hiring, or supervising experience, and the buildings they were put in charge of managing were among the worst in their cities. But tenants embraced the opportunity, and conservative think tanks pushed to expand the venture to other cities. When the Metropolitan Planning Council surveyed residents of Cabrini Green and 2 other public housing developments in Chicago and found that many of the unemployed single mothers would much rather work than receive benefits. They've been trained as seamstresses, cosmetologists, cashiers, teachers, secretaries, and cooks. Here was an untapped pool of labor. Quote, the brave pioneers of resident management are sowing seeds of hope and possibility in cities across our nation, end quote, Ronald Reagan declared from the White House. Dolores Wilson didn't think too much of the idea when she first heard about it. Quote, I didn't even know what resident management meant, end quote, she'd say. But then someone from the MPC phoned her at the water department. Because the people in her high-rise had shown initiative, because they'd already done so much to better their home, the person hoped that Dolores and the other residents in her building would apply for the program. Dolores sought the advice of one of her neighbors, Cora Moore. A mother of 6, Moore worked hard for the CHA as the assistant manager of 1230 North Burling and had lived at Cabrini Green since 1969. Quote, yeah, we want resident management, end quote, she shouted, saying this was the opportunity they'd been waiting for. Dolores signed them up. Okay, and that brings us to a changing of the themes within this chapter. What stands out to me in there is again a callback to something that we read in Race Matters by Cornel West, and that is that in truth the solutions to a lot of the issues that exist in the black community and in brown community and communities of color and poor and working class communities is not something that you will find in any single party line. And I'll say that to say that if you just follow whatever agenda is laid out by Democrats or by liberals, you won't find it. If you follow out whatever agenda is laid out by conservatives and Republicans, you won't find it. But when you look at both of the agenda pieces that are laid out in both parties, you find pieces that fit to solving some of the issues that exist. And the truth of the matter is, and Cornel West spoke about this, is that too often Democrats and liberals have this idea of not wanting to challenge the mentality or challenge the type of thinking that exists in black communities or brown communities, because they don't want to be deemed as racist by challenging certain things. And then on the other side, far too often, the Republicans and conservatives don't want to challenge the society and the type of institutional issues that exist that have bred the mentality that exists in brown and black and brown communities. And of course, we've already spoke about how there is not a monolith of a mentality, or there's not one mentality that exists. And so it's wrong. And as they found out, once they went and spoke to the women that lived in these public housing, they realized that they would much rather work than be given handouts. And that was one of the things we talked about in the previous episode. But the situations that they were living in, it was almost more advantageous for them to not work than it was to go and work and not have livable wages. The people living in the public housing didn't want the gangs to be running amok in the building. They didn't want the building to be dirty and to have graffiti over it. They wanted to be able to take responsibility and accountability and take the power into their own hands to fix these buildings up. And once they were organized and mobilized, they were able to do those things. And so often the truth is that it needs to be programs that are put in place to help people in these situations be able to attain self-determination, because far too often, because of generations of oppression, generations of racism, generations of subjugation, people have not had the proper avenues or the proper education to organize themselves and to mobilize themselves. And so we read here that once those opportunities began to be able to be created, people were happy to not be on public house or not be on welfare. People were happy to get paid to take care of the neighborhood, or but the buildings that they were living in. And so I just, again, think that as black people, as brown people, as people of color, as working class people, as poor people, we cannot allow ourselves to fall victims to the two-party political system that exists here. We must not look at, we must not agree with the agenda of a Democrat just because they're a Democrat, and we must not completely disagree with an agenda that may be laid out by a Republican because they're Republican. And what we must instead do is look at these items on these agendas and find out which things can be used from these different agendas to benefit people in certain situations. Okay. There was a 10-year-old from the Reds named Ronald Dennis. He didn't have JR's way with words or athletic abilities. He wasn't shrewd or confident like Kelvin Cannon, but he was big and powerful for his age, and he'd acquired the nickname Dirty Rod. He'd, quote, do dirt, end quote, on the other little kids, grabbing them by the neck as they were heading to the candy store on Orleans Street and robbing them of their change. Also, he'd admit himself he was playing dirty. His mother got hooked on drugs and stopped mothering. His father wasn't around. The family had little money, and his clothes were raggedy and unwashed. Rod was surprised one day in 1989 when a Gangster Disciples coordinator told him the gang had been checking him out for a few years and liked what it was seeing. He said the GDs didn't usually bring young fellas into the fold, but they recognized in Rodnell a fearlessness and believed with a little guidance he could be someone. A boy starving for sustenance of all sorts, Rodnell was spellbound by the praise. He was introduced to the GDs operating on the Wild End, the southern portion of Cabrini Green that included some of the red towers and the row houses. Quote, what do you feel you can do for this organization? End quote, a GD governor asked him. Quote, I can do whatever you want me to do. End quote, Rodnell shouted too quickly, and the group of young men around him laughed. The gang members saw that Rodnell lacked for many things, and they gave him new shoes and clothes, all in the GD colors of black and blue. In return, he was expected to make certain sacrifices. For someone at the bottom rung of the organization, that meant security time. Every day after school, from 3:30 until 9, he stood outside one of the two high-rises. Others sold drugs from inside the building. His job was to yell, quote, one time, lights out, end quote, when the police approached. The disciples always talked about the 5 Ps, quote, proper preparation prevents poor performance, end quote. Rod now lived by this credo. He attended regular meetings the gang held at the Lower North Center, in the gym or pool room, where they discussed business and neighborhood events of the past week. They were instructed that it was their job to take out their enemies. They were at war with the vice lords and the Stones and the nearby towers. A higher-up would say, quote, who wants to go on a mission, end quote. Rodnell, eager to show how motivated he was, would be among the first to volunteer. When he was 13, in March 1992, Rodnell went on a mission. It was a freezing Sunday afternoon, and one of Rodnell's best friends, a boy who would soon be killed, stepped into a circle of GDs. He held out a handgun, a silver .22. He spotted a group of vice lords not far from Jenner School. Who among them was going to teach the vice lords a lesson? Rodnell reached for the gun. He ran over to the 500 West Oak building, a couple 100 feet away, and ducked behind a dumpster by the old Deaf Corner. People were gathered outside the front entrance of the high-rise. Rodnell could hear the sound of his gun. Rodnell could hear the sound his gun made, feel the recoil, but otherwise his mind went blank. When he realized he'd emptied the chamber, he ran back to his building, handing off the gun to another boy who hid it inside an elevator shaft. He took a seat on the stairs outside the tower, breathing heavily into the cold air, and tried to act as if nothing had happened. And maybe nothing had. Less than 10 minutes had passed since he grabbed the gun, and here he was, back where he started. For most shootings, a cop car or maybe 2 showed up. But 10 now raced down Oak, along with an ambulance. Rodnell had to check out the commotion, and he returned to the scene of the crime, sauntering over as casually as he could. Yellow tape surrounded the building's entrance, and a white sheet was draped over what had to be a body. The thought of killing someone hadn't actually entered Rod's mind. The victim, he learned, was a boy named Anthony Felton, a 9-year-old who had no part in the Vice Lords or any other gang. Rodnell knew the child's family. He retreated to his building. 2 police officers were already up on his ramp talking to his mother. Someone must have identified him as the shooter. He saw a police cruiser and ducked into one of the high-rises. There were 2 plainclothes cops at Cabrini Green, whom everyone called Eddie Murphy and 21. They were young and black, and they treated the residents with respect, even the guys they arrested, referring to them as their, quote, clients, end quote. When things were calm at Cabrini, the officers would visit families in their apartments. They lifted weights with guys, helped run a baseball little league, and challenged boys on the basketball courts to games of 2-on-2. People at Cabrini believed that Eddie Murphy and 21, unlike other cops, wouldn't slap them around or plant dope on them or pocket their money. And when a guy committed a serious crime and had exhausted his options, he sometimes refused to turn himself in to anyone else but them. Now the officers known as Eddie Murphy found Rodnell's cousin and asked him to pass along a message. Quote, if Rod runs, we'll have to shoot him, end quote. Rodnell didn't have anywhere to run. He was 13 and all he knew was Cabrini Green. The next night, sleepless and panicked, he walked over to the police station on the ground floor of the 365 West Oak high-rise and banged on the cage. An officer asked him what he wanted. Quote, I heard you all were looking for me, end quote. Quote, who are you? End quote, the cop asked. Quote, I'm Rodnell Dennis. I'm the one that shot that kid, end quote. Because of the record he'd amassed since the age of 7, criminal damage to property, petty vandalism, theft, attempted theft, shoplifting, battery, robbery, possession of a weapon, auto theft. He was transferred from juvenile to criminal court and tried as an adult. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to 39 years. Okay. I think what stands out to me in that passage is the reminder of people being products of their environment. And as we have read for over 160 pages now at this point, the environment that existed in these public housings were ones that bred violence. And again, I think what's important to articulate when we speak about situations like this is that the individual has to bear responsibility for their actions. The individual has to be accountable for their actions. You can't ask for a police officer or a politician to be responsible and accountable for their individual actions, but not ask for a community member to be responsible and accountable for their individual actions. But just like in the cases of holding a police officer individually or a politician individually accountable, the next step must be to look at the institution that breeds the individual to make those decisions, and to look at the society and the circumstances and situations that breed the individual to make those decisions, or that influence the individual to make those decisions. And the same way when a police officer shoots an individual or plants drugs on an individual or assaults an individual, the institution of policing has to be examined. When a politician goes back on their word or does something that is detrimental to a community in a city, the institution of politics or the party that they belong to has to be examined. We also have to examine the living conditions that existed for Rod. We also have to examine the fact that he had been arrested since he was 7 for criminal damage to property, petty vandalism, theft, attempted theft, shoplifting, battery, robbery, possession of a weapon, auto theft. And as much as somebody may say for each one of those things that they should have threw him in jail earlier so he couldn't have got to the point of shooting this 9-year-old, it's also something to be said that there should have been some type of program or something that was put in place that recognized that this young man couldn't continue to go back to the same environments that he was in before he committed each one of these crimes, before he did each one of these things. There has to be and again, this is with situations like this, it's always difficult to try to empathize or to try to find understanding for somebody who has victimized someone else. But the truth of the matter is, until we can do that, we will never be able to find solutions to victimizations. And so that's what stands out to me in there. And also the statement from the police officers that if he ran, they would have to shoot him, which is, irregardless of any action that somebody makes, they should still be brought into jail and arrested and go through the system in one piece. And that's the reason that if somebody was to shoot your brother, if somebody was to rob you or rob your sister or break into your friend's house, it shouldn't be you that should be the one picking and deciding what happens to them. The person who has been victimized should never be the one, or the mentality of putting yourself in a position of somebody who has been victimized should not be the mentality that is used when it's time to get justice after a victimization has happened. We cannot respond to inhumaneness with inhumaneness, because that is not going to get to a place of eradicating inhumaneness. It only gets to a place of duplicating it and multiplying it. All right. Let's try to, all right, we're going to end this episode here because we said breaking in the passage, or a change of theme in the chapter that we're reading, and I want to try to make sure that we don't start the next episode in the middle of a passage. So I want to thank people for taking the time to listen to this episode. We're close to the 30-minute mark, a little bit under. I would encourage people to go back and listen to previous episodes of Rockford Reading Daily if you have not before. We began by reading Have Black Lives Ever Mattered by Mumia Abu-Jamal. We then read Race Matters by Cornel West. We followed that up by reading Cops, Citizens, and Power by Steve Herbert. We followed that book up by reading Civil Disobedience by Henry Thoreau. We followed that up by reading Women, Race, and Class by Angela Y. Davis. And then the thing we read right before this was Letter from Birmingham Jail by Martin Luther King Jr. And as I've said before, we're currently reading High Risers by Ben Austin. We are trying to read all these different things and be able to cross-reference different things that we have read in different pieces of literature, all in an effort to be able to articulate solutions and articulate philosophies and ideologies and tactics for ending police terrorism, mass incarceration, and racial injustice. So I'll talk to you tomorrow. Share this on whatever platform you're listening to it on.